polis of Athens was a city-state that dominated the Hellenic world, with footholds throughout the Aegean Sea and beyond. Athens also had an undeniable impact on culture and art, with theatre, for example, being shaped in this polis. But today, instead of focusing on the politics of Athens and the figures which dwelt there, we're going to be examining the more intimate details of life in Athens to see how the city would be experienced by ordinary people in the classical period. Clothing is the perfect place to start when trying to reconstruct life in ancient Athens, not only because of the large extent of material depictions of people's clothing which have survived, but also because clothes can give us an insight into the minds of the people of the past. We can infer what people's clothing looked like in the classical period of Athens through various means. The wealth of surviving archaeology, such as pots, frescoes, statues, and even some kinds of surviving fabric. This, paired with the written sources which survive, give us an idea of what Athenians wore in the classical age. The basic garments would have been similar for everybody, some kind of tunic, either a chiton, a belted tunic made of light material such as linen or sometimes silk for richer Athenians, or a peplos, which was made of heavier material. These tunics would have usually been made of a single rectangle of fabric. They would have been fastened at the shoulders, either sewn or more usually held together with brooches or pins, and then belted at the waist, which often gave them a fold around the waist area. The length of the chiton or peplos would depend upon the presentation of the wearer, with more feminine styles tending to be longer, and masculine styles shorter. The lengths of tunics were very much dependent on occupation too, with shorter style tunics used for certain jobs such as acting or sports. Clothes were layered too, to offer protection from the elements and sun. The himation, which was a garment worn over the tunic. It's best described as a kind of cloak or mantle, which was draped all over the body. There was a shorter cloak which was also worn too, called the chlamys, usually associated with more physically rigorous activities and jobs, such as hunting, riding, or military combat. Veils were also worn by ancient Athenians, particularly women, for whom it was a societal expectation for modesty. Whilst clothes could be made out of imported fabrics such as silk, it was more common that they were made from linen or wool, which usually was homespun, with spinning and weaving an expected specialism for Athenian women across class divides. It might be easy to believe that clothes were made of plain white fabrics, but Athenians dyed their clothes to adorn themselves with colours from natural dyes, yellows, reds, blues, and even purple for those who could afford the expense of it. Shoes were dependent on one's occupation and status, but leather sandals or boots were likely the most common options for Athenians. Alongside more practical pieces, Athenians used jewellery to adorn their appearances, some of which has survived in archaeological digs. In classical Athens, hygiene practices were a commonality, with people bathing using olive oil. Masculine ideals in the polis also emphasised shorter hair and beards, whilst feminine beauty was heavily bound up with long and styled hair, which was achieved through various means: curling, cutting, styling, straightening, even sometimes using hair dye. The Athenian diet was fairly broad, with the polis being at the centre of trade, commerce and travel in the ancient world. Flavours that dominated the Athenian palate include oregano, vinegar, salt, garlic, cumin, as well as honey for sweetness. Wheat and barley were both consumed in ancient Athens, but barley tended to be the grain of choice. It was eaten in bread, most commonly barley cakes. Barley was also eaten in a porridge, or sometimes cooked into dishes. Dairy was a food group also consumed by the Athenians, but mostly as cheese, with butter and milk used more for medicinal purposes. Meat was a source of protein for the Athenians. Mutton, pork, beef, chicken, geese, and goat were animals which were reared for consumption, but hunted game was equally important. Deer, wild boar, hare, and various species of birds were eaten. Meat especially was significant at certain festivals, such as the Panathenaea, where animal sacrifices were made, and every Athenian citizen was entitled to a helping of the remaining meat. Other sources of protein were available. Fish in particular was important to the Greek diet in general, being a peoples dominated by the sea. It was a staple food for Greeks especially who lived in urban environments. Oysters, tuna, shrimp, anchovy, eels, mullets, mackerel and octopus to name a few. Legumes and vegetables were also part of the Athenian diet. Beans, chickpeas, lentils, asparagus, cabbage, onion and peas. Olives were a vital staple food for all Greeks, being consumed across the class spectrum. Olive oil held a special place in the Athenians' diet, as well as their broader economy. Olive oil was one of the main exports of the polis, and even was used as a prize in sporting events such as the Olympics. A variety of fruit were also eaten: figs, apples, cherries, dates, pears, pistachios, peaches and grapes. Grapes of course had other purposes, being made into wine. Athenians drank wine made across the Aegean, especially from islands like Lesbos and Chios. It was common for wine to be flavoured with spices and honey, but wine was also diluted with water, because drinking wine straight was associated by the Greeks with barbarism. Food was not just seen as sustenance in ancient Athens, but it was closely associated with health and well-being, with many surviving sources that we have on food being from medicinal works, such as Hippocrates. Plato, in the records that we have of his work, even makes reference to having a good diet for the health of one's body and mind. Food in Athens, like in Rome, was a sign of wealth and status. Rich Athenians had elaborate banquets in which multiple courses of food were eaten. After banquets, symposiums were held, in which wine and intellectual discussions took place alongside entertainments, which highlights the place that food had in Athenian society. The size of houses in classical Athens depended on the class of the owner, but in general, most houses were built the same, out of mud bricks on a stone foundation, with terracotta roof tiles and windows to allow airflow. They also typically were built around a central courtyard, with only one entrance from the street into the house. For wealthy Athenians, houses would be larger, having multiple rooms for set functions, a kitchen, a dining room, and sleeping quarters, for example. These upper-class households would also have other luxurious features, such as a private well and mosaic flooring. The houses of ordinary Athenians would, in comparison, only have a few rooms, which would be multifunctional, with living areas also serving as sleeping areas, for example. Domestic spaces also had commercial uses, with workshops situated in the home. The poorest Athenians would not own their own houses, but instead would rent accommodation, which usually would have been for multiple inhabitants in one building. Ancient Greek houses are usually thought as being split into gendered spaces, with the public-facing men's quarters juxtaposed with the private women's quarters. However, Many historians have contested this idea, such as Katherine B. Harrington, who instead proposes that the use of domestic spaces in Athens was flexible and varied depending on the time of day and social identities of those present. When we imagine ancient Athens, we perhaps think of a more equal society because of the polis's democratic system. Prior to the classical age, Athens had been ruled in ways which were much more hierarchical, by kings, tyrants, or by groups of elite in an oligarchy. However, by the 5th century, Athens had transformed into a democracy, meaning politics involved the demos, the people. Athens had a direct democracy, meaning that every Athenian citizen had the right to be involved in decision-making firsthand. For example, all citizens had the right to attend the assembly to vote on polis policy. Furthermore, the Athenian state offered early forms of welfare to those in need, such as orphans, and they also created public work programs to aid unemployment. However, it must be acknowledged that even with these measures in place, ancient Athens was still permeated by levels of inequality. Hierarchical structures still existed in Athens, with wealth still a large determiner in the amount of political power one held. This is since, in practice, poorer citizens could not always afford to participate in democracy, as it took away from their ability to earn money. This hierarchical structure in Athens was also underpinned, as Danielle Kellogg argues, by the state of citizenship and non-citizenship, of freedom and unfreedom. Citizenship, the very identity which entitled Athenians to participate in democracy, had limited scope. Out of a population of roughly 250,000 inhabitants, the polis of Athens only had 30,000 to 40,000 citizens. This was because the only people given citizenship were adult males who could prove their Athenian heritage. This excluded the larger population of women, slaves, and those of non-Athenian heritage, which barred them from legitimate ways of exerting power. This bled into the home life of Athenians. The oikos, household, was headed by male citizens, with non-citizens, women and slaves, expected to be deferential to them. On top of this, in ancient Athens, slavery was not only legal, but it was a socially expected practice, and was built into the very fabric of society, with slaves used for labour in home and public life, in silver mines, on building sites, and on warships. Slaves virtually had no legal rights and were seen as the property of their masters, which created a massive power imbalance. This imbalance of power also existed in gender relations. Women had very little legal rights and were seen as the property of their husbands, fathers, or other male relatives. Girls were married off as young as 12 to men twice their age. Whilst not always being a practical reality, with poorer women working to support themselves and their families, the ideal woman in Athenian society did not participate in public life and instead existed only in the sphere of the home. Of course, ideals and reality did not always align, and women found ways to exert power over their own lives and the world around them, a complex topic well worth a whole video dedicated to it. Thus, life in ancient Athens was very much determined by your identity, by class, heritage, and gender. For male citizens, Athens offered a vibrant public life of intellectualism, culture, and democracy, which the city is remembered for. But for women, slaves, the poor, and those deemed to be outsiders, such things were hard to access, and life remained as hierarchical as ever. Hi there, Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. I also have an Instagram and a TikTok page which I have linked below. Again, thank you so much for watching. I have been Our Historia, and until next time.